Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Tonight, we've some of the most disturbing true crime cases from around the world. Encounters that prove the real danger is always lurking somewhere. It's not hiding in the dark. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let's step into true crime cases together. John Emil List in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Westfield, New Jersey. There was a man who lived an ordinary life. John Emil List, a Sunday school teacher and an accountant, was the epitome of respectability. On the surface, he was an upstanding citizen, a man of faith and discipline, seemingly content in his modest home with his wife, children, and mother. But beneath the calm exterior, John harbored a deep darkness, a secret rage that had been quietly simmering for years. No one could have ever predicted that this seemingly gentle man would become one of the most chilling figures in American criminal history. It was November 9th, 1971, when the nightmare began. The List family home was filled with the sounds of typical family life. But behind closed doors, a storm was brewing. As the clock ticked into the evening, John would carry out a brutal and methodical massacre that would forever change the course of his life and the lives of those who knew him. In a calculated, cold-blooded act, John murdered his wife, Helen, his mother, Alma, and his 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. The methodical nature of the killings was as disturbing as it was horrifying. He shot each family member in the head, one by one, in cold blood. The sound of each bullet seemed to echo in the walls of the home, marking the end of an era for the List family. Afterward, he did not call for help, nor did he show any sign of remorse. He simply carried on with his life, taking deliberate steps to erase every trace of his family's existence. He meticulously cleaned the crime scene, arranged the bodies, and then vanished into thin air. For the next 18 years, John Emil List would be a ghost, a name whispered in the darkest corners of criminal lore, a man who had evaded justice for nearly 2 decades. His disappearance was as puzzling as his crime. List didn't just flee the scene. He erased his identity entirely. He abandoned his car, his possessions, and even assumed a new identity, becoming Robert Peter Clark. His meticulous planning extended to his escape. John List took on a new life, moving across the country, settling in places far from New Jersey. He worked various jobs, including as a clerk, always staying just out of reach of the law. As the years passed, his name faded from the public consciousness, but his chilling crime remained in the background, haunting investigators who were never able to piece together the full extent of his story. Then, in 1989, a breakthrough came in the most unexpected of ways. The television program America's Most Wanted aired a segment on the List case, showcasing a forensic artist's age progression of what List might look like after 18 years. It was a turning point in the investigation. For the first time, the world was seeing the face of a man who had slipped through the cracks of the justice system for so long. It was only a matter of time before someone recognized him. The breakthrough came quickly. A woman who knew List under his alias called the Tip Line. And just like that, the man who had been living in the shadows for nearly 2 decades was caught. He was arrested in Virginia, a far cry from the quiet streets of Westfield, where his nightmare had begun. The man who had killed his entire family, leaving behind a trail of confusion and pain, was finally in custody. In 1990, John Emil List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He would spend his final years behind bars, a man who had tried to outrun his past, but ultimately could not escape the justice he so desperately avoided. Ronald Gene Simmons, in the cold, December of 1987, in the rural town of Dover, Arkansas, a darkness swept over a once peaceful family. Ronald Gene Simmons, a man whose quiet demeanor hid a deep well of rage, began a week-long spree of violence that would leave 16 people dead, including his own children, grandchildren, and in-laws. Simmons had lived a life filled with personal disappointments and a desire for control over his chaotic world. Little did anyone know that this desire for power would manifest in the most horrifying way imaginable. For years, Ronald had been a controlling, abusive presence in his family's lives. He had fathered several children, but his relationship with them was strained, at best. His marriage was a grim partnership, built on a foundation of fear and manipulation. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, his mental state was deteriorating. Simmons had been unemployed and facing financial ruin. But more than that, there were whispers of a breakdown. His deep-seated rage toward his family and the world had reached a boiling point. It began on December 22nd, 1987, with a brutal act that would mark the first of many. Simmons killed his wife, his son, and his daughter-in-law, but the killings didn't stop there. Over the course of the next few days, his killing spree escalated, with Simmons targeting his extended family, including his grandchildren. His victims were brutally shot, and in many cases, their bodies were left to be discovered by those who would come across them later. Each murder was committed with a cold, detached brutality, a pattern of violence that seemed to be spiraling out of control. Simmons didn't just kill his family members. He systematically destroyed the lives of everyone he touched. He murdered his children and grandchildren in cold blood, shooting them in their own homes, trapping them in their own fear. The bloodshed continued over the span of several days as Simmons methodically wiped out his family, one by one. By the time it was over, he had killed his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and several others, leaving only one survivor to tell the tale, a teenage girl who managed to escape the carnage. After the killings, Simmons did not flee immediately. Instead, he wandered through the days, acting as though nothing had happened, a figure of chilling calm in the aftermath of his own madness. It wasn't until after the bodies had been discovered and the search for the killer began that Ronald Gene Simmons finally came under suspicion. When authorities closed in on him, they found him in a remote cabin where he was arrested without a struggle. Ronald Gene Simmons was eventually tried for the mass murders and found guilty on multiple counts of murder. In 1990, he was executed by lethal injection, the last chapter of a life that had spiraled out of control in the most horrifying way. The tragedy left a scar on the community of Dover, Arkansas, and the ripple effects of his brutal killings would haunt the survivors and those who had known him for years to come. His story serves as a stark reminder of the horrors that can lurk behind the closed doors of a seemingly ordinary family, where the greatest of evils can sometimes be hidden in plain sight. Chris Watts, in the sleepy, picturesque town of Frederick, Colorado, a seemingly happy family lived under the warm glow of suburban life. Chris Watts, a loving father to two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, and a devoted husband to his pregnant wife, Shanann, appeared to have it all. To their friends, family, and neighbors, the Watts family was the picture of perfection. They were well-liked, active on social media, and appeared to lead a life filled with love and promise. But behind the smiles, behind the facade, something far darker was brewing, a darkness that would soon take away everything. On the morning of August 13th, 2018, the world awoke to a nightmare. Shanann, who was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, and their two daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3, were reported missing. Chris Watts, distraught and seemingly desperate, appeared on television, pleading for their safe return. He spoke about his love for his family and how much they meant to him. His public display of anguish only added to the horror of the missing persons case. The community rallied around the Watts family, organizing search parties and social media campaigns to locate Shanann and her daughters. But as days passed with no sign of the family, the chilling truth began to emerge. It wasn't long before the cracks in Chris Watts' story began to show. His behavior became increasingly erratic, his accounts inconsistent. The police, growing suspicious, began to probe deeper into his life. Investigators uncovered evidence that Watts had been having an affair with a coworker, a woman he had been secretly seeing behind his wife's back. The affair, coupled with the financial pressures the family had been facing, painted a picture of a man on the edge, someone who had lost control and was desperate to escape his reality. On August 15th, just 2 days after the disappearance of his family, Watts was taken into custody. During questioning, the police confronted him with the mounting evidence, including video footage of him loading his truck with the bodies of his wife and daughters. With no more lies to tell, Chris Watts finally confessed to the horrific killings. He admitted to strangling Shanann in a fit of rage after an argument about his affair. But that wasn't where the horror ended. After killing Shanann, he went into the room where his daughters were sleeping and murdered them as well. Bella and Celeste were smothered, each child killed while they were still in their beds. Chris Watts then drove their bodies to an oil field where he worked and disposed of their remains, burying Shanann in a shallow grave and dumping his daughters' bodies in an oil tank. The brutality of his actions, the calculated nature of his crimes, and the betrayal of the family he had sworn to protect shocked the world. Watts' confession sent shockwaves through the community, leaving those who knew the family in disbelief. The man who had been portrayed as a devoted husband and father was, in fact, a cold-blooded killer. In 2019, Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The nightmare he created left a lasting scar on the lives of all who knew the Watts family, and the world would never forget the haunting image of a man who took everything he had for granted, only to destroy it in the most horrific way imaginable. Dennis Rader, BTK killer. For decades, the city of Wichita, Kansas, lived in fear, unaware that a killer was lurking in their midst, a man who seemed like just another ordinary citizen, yet who harbored an insatiable thirst for death. Dennis Rader, a church volunteer, husband, father, and devoted member of his community, was the epitome of a well-respected man, someone who could blend into the background of everyday life with ease. But behind this facade of normalcy, Rader was hiding something far more sinister. He was the infamous BTK killer, a man whose brutal murders would remain unsolved for over 30 years, leaving a community terrified and questioning everything they knew about those around them. The BTK killer's reign of terror began in 1974 with the brutal killings of the Otero family. In a horrific and methodical act, Rader bound, tortured, and killed the Oteros, Joseph, Julie, and their 2 children, Josephine and Charlie. This was just the beginning. Over the next several years, Rader would continue his killing spree, targeting random victims with chilling precision, always leaving behind a pattern. Bind, torture, kill. It was a phrase that would forever define his identity. His victims were often bound with rope or wire, subjected to unimaginable torture, and then killed in cold blood. He would leave behind taunting messages and trophies, things like photographs, letters, and pieces of the crime scene, for the police, daring them to catch him. And for years, they couldn't. He eluded capture with ease, blending into society as a seemingly harmless family man, a respected member of his church, even a leader in the community. To the outside world, he was nothing more than a mild-mannered man with no criminal history, the last person anyone would ever suspect. But Dennis Rader was meticulous. He was driven by a compulsion, a need to control his victims, to instill fear, and to assert his dominance over those he deemed worthy of his violence. And as the years went on, his killings grew bolder. He continued to send cryptic letters to the police, taunting them with clues about his next move, all while maintaining the guise of an upstanding citizen. His need for attention, for recognition, became his undoing. In 2004, after years of silence, Rader reemerged, sending a letter to the police that included a floppy disk. The disk, which seemed harmless at first, would be the key to his capture. Police forensic experts were able to trace the disk back to Rader's computer, and within days, they had the man who had terrorized Wichita for so long in custody. Dennis Rader was arrested on February 25, 2005, and charged with the murders of 10 people between 1974 and 1991. His arrest sent shockwaves through the community and the country. The man who had been living among them, leading a double life as a killer, was finally exposed. During his trial, Rader admitted to the murders, describing in disturbing detail how he had lured his victims, bound them, tortured them, and taken their lives. In 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Rader's story is one of the most chilling examples of the duality of human nature. A man who lived a lie, hiding his true identity beneath a mask of respectability. The BTK killer's reign of terror left an indelible mark on the city of Wichita, a city that would never again be able to see the people around them as they once had. It's a haunting reminder of the monsters who walk among us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, the windswept moors of England, have long held a haunting presence in criminal lore, made even darker by the twisted acts committed there in the 1960s. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, a couple driven by their own perverse desires, became infamous for the atrocities they inflicted upon innocent children. Their reign of terror, which spanned from 1963 to 1965, would not only forever scar the landscape of the moors, but also the minds of everyone who came to know their names. Together, they became known as the Moors Murderers, one of the most infamous duos in British criminal history. In the beginning, Brady and Hindley appeared to be just another young couple. Brady, a cold and calculating man, and Hindley, a seemingly ordinary young woman, had no real history of criminal activity before they met. But under the surface of their everyday lives, something monstrous was brewing. Brady, an individual with a dangerous obsession for power and control, manipulated Hindley into becoming his accomplice. Their twisted bond would see them target the most vulnerable members of society, children. Together, they would abduct, sexually assault, and murder 5 innocent victims. Each of their murders was more horrifying than the last, with the pair going to great lengths to conceal their crimes, leaving the families of their victims to suffer in ignorance for years. The first known victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed, who disappeared on her way to a dance in July 1963. Her body was discovered on the moors in 1987, years after the crime. The brutality escalated when, in November of that same year, they abducted and murdered 12-year-old John Kilbride before moving on to Keith Bennett in June 1964. The pair's actions were marked by an escalating sense of depravity. Each victim was brutally murdered, their bodies discarded in the desolate, windblown moors. But it wasn't until they murdered 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey and 17-year-old Edward Evans that their reign of terror began to unravel. In December of 1965, Hindley, who had once appeared to be a caring companion, broke under the weight of the horrors she had helped create. A seemingly innocent woman, Hindley was as complicit in the acts as Brady, but it was her involvement in the final murder that led to their capture. After they murdered Evans, Hindley's guilt began to eat away at her, and she made the fateful decision to go to the police, revealing the horrifying details of their murders. The investigation led authorities to the moors, where the bodies of the 5 victims were discovered. Brady, the cold mastermind, was arrested along with Hindley, his accomplice. The case shocked the nation as it revealed the horrifying extent of the couple's depravity. The media's portrayal of the Moors murderers painted a chilling picture of 2 individuals who had turned the desolate landscape of the Moors into their own personal hunting ground. In 1966, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were convicted of the murders of 3 children, though Brady was later believed to be responsible for the deaths of others. The pair's case became a symbol of the grotesque depths of human depravity. Brady was sentenced to life imprisonment, where he would remain until his death in 2017. Hindley was also sentenced to life, but after decades of appeals for parole, she died in 2002. The Moors murderers left a legacy of terror and loss that would haunt the British public for years to come, forever remembered as one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. Ed Gein, in the small, quiet town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, there existed a figure who would go on to define one of the most grotesque and disturbing archetypes in American crime. Ed Gein, a reclusive and deeply troubled man, would forever alter the landscape of horror and true crime. Known as the Butcher of Plainfield, Gein's crimes were not just about murder, but about desecration, perversion, and the disturbing lengths to which a broken mind could be pushed. His twisted legacy inspired some of the most iconic fictional killers in history, including Norman Bates from Psycho and Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yet, behind these fictional characters, there was the very real and terrifying story of a man who committed unimaginable horrors in the darkest corners of his home. Gein's crimes, however, began in a place of strange and unsettling isolation. Born in 1906 to a domineering and religiously fanatical mother, Gein was raised in an oppressive environment that fostered his psychological unraveling. His mother, Augusta, controlled every aspect of his life, instilling in him a deep, almost pathological fear of women. She taught him to loathe anything that wasn't part of her strict, puritanical world. Gein's life was a lonely one, filled with rejection and stunted social growth. His mental state worsened after the death of his mother in 1945, leaving him completely unmoored and vulnerable to the demons inside his mind. Gein's descent into madness began in the early 1950s. After the death of his mother, he began robbing graves, exhuming bodies of women who resembled his late mother. What he did with these bodies was unimaginable. He stripped the skin from the corpses, fashioned it into clothing, masks, and furniture, and took various body parts to use as grotesque trophies. These macabre creations became his obsession, the manifestation of a mind unhinged by years of emotional abuse and trauma. But it wasn't until 1957 that Gein's dark world was exposed. The disappearance of a local woman, Bernice Worden, led authorities to his home. What they discovered inside was beyond comprehension. In his house, investigators found the severed heads of women, human remains, and furniture made from human skin. Gein had fashioned a woman suit from the skin of his victims, which he would wear in an attempt to transform himself into his mother. The discovery was nothing short of horrifying, as the full extent of his macabre activities became clear. Ed Gein was arrested on November 16, 1957, and charged with the murder of Bernice Worden, although he was suspected of having committed other murders. He confessed to 2 murders, though he was never tried for the others. In 1958, Gein was declared insane and sent to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he would spend the remainder of his life. He died in 1984, a broken man, his twisted legacy forever imprinted on the fabric of American horror. Gein's story is a chilling reminder of the dark forces that can fester in the human psyche. A man who was shaped by isolation, abuse, and madness. Ed Gein's crimes left a stain on American history that would influence generations of horror fiction. His actions blurred the line between reality and the grotesque, and his name lives on as one of the most disturbed individuals to ever walk the earth. Richard Speck. On the night of July 13th, 1966, the city of Chicago was thrust into a nightmare that would leave a permanent scar on the community. Richard Speck, a man whose anger and brutality would soon become infamous, entered a small apartment on the south side of Chicago and committed one of the most horrific crimes in American history. Speck, a man with a long history of violence and criminal behavior, would kill 8 young student nurses, all in one night. It started innocuously enough. Speck, who had recently arrived in Chicago, was no stranger to violence. His criminal history was marred by petty thefts and assaults, but nothing compared to the savagery he was about to unleash. On that fateful night, Speck broke into the dormitory where the nurses lived, all of whom were studying at South Chicago Community Hospital. He tied them up, systematically went about torturing them, and then killed them one by one, leaving a trail of blood and devastation in his wake. The crime was brutal, calculated, and callous. Each victim was strangled or stabbed. Speck, however, did not kill them all at once. He took his time, forcing the women to endure unimaginable horrors before they were silenced forever. The chilling nature of the killings left investigators scrambling to find any lead. Speck, who had been the target of several run-ins with the law before, seemed to blend into the background after the murders. He was a man whose image was as ordinary as it was terrifying. The massacre was so well executed that for a while, it seemed like the killer would get away with the unimaginable. But what Speck didn't know was that one of the student nurses, a woman named Cora, had survived the attack. She had managed to hide under a bed, too terrified to move, her heart racing in the darkness as Speck wreaked havoc around her. Cora's survival would prove to be the key that unlocked the mystery of the murders. In the weeks that followed, Speck's image was circulated through the media, and he became the prime suspect. On the night of his capture, the police were able to locate Speck through tips from people who had seen him in the area. He was arrested on July 17, 1966, just days after the murders. Despite his attempts to deny involvement, the evidence against him was overwhelming. His fingerprints were found at the scene, and Cora, the lone survivor, identified him in a lineup. Richard Speck was convicted of the murders of the 8 student nurses and sentenced to 400 to 1,200 years in prison. His case became one of the most high-profile criminal cases of the 1960s, and his horrifying crime was cemented in American criminal lore. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, where he would ultimately die in 1991 from a heart attack. Speck's story is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can reside in the most unassuming individuals. A man whose violent tendencies, hidden behind the veneer of normalcy, would devastate the lives of countless people. Robert Spangler. The name Robert Spangler may not be as widely known as some of the more infamous serial killers, but his crimes were no less brutal or shocking. Spangler's story is one of manipulation, deception, and cold-blooded murder that spanned 2 decades. Over the course of 16 years, Spangler killed his first wife and her daughter, and then, after remarrying, went on to kill his second wife and stepdaughter. His case is a haunting tale of how a man's life could become a deadly web of lies, where death seemed to be the only way out. In 1978, Spangler committed his first known murder. His wife, Barbara, and her daughter, Diane, had been married to him for years, but their relationship had grown strained. Spangler, it seems, had grown tired of his life and was facing increasing financial difficulties. He plotted the deaths of his wife and stepdaughter, staging their deaths as a tragic double suicide. Spangler claimed that the 2 women had killed themselves, but the evidence didn't add up. The authorities were suspicious, but at the time, they were unable to link him directly to the crime. It wasn't until 1994 that Spangler's deadly pattern resurfaced. After the murder of his first family, he remarried a woman named Elaine, and they moved to a new town. They lived a relatively quiet life, at least on the surface, but beneath the normalcy, Spangler was a ticking time bomb. And once again, he would turn to murder. This time, it was his second wife, Elaine, and her daughter, Julie, who would become his victims. Spangler, in a chilling repetition of his first crime, staged their deaths in a way that would make it seem as though they had died accidentally. However, just as with his first wife, the authorities began to unravel the web of lies that Spangler had spun. Spangler's second wife, Elaine, had been a devoted mother and wife, and her death, along with her daughters, sparked the beginning of a new investigation into Spangler's past. The authorities re-examined the case of his first wife and stepdaughter's deaths and began to see the disturbing similarities. Finally, in 2000, Spangler was arrested after forensic evidence linked him to the murders of both families. He had thought he could outsmart the system, but the truth always finds a way to surface. In 2001, Spangler was convicted of the murders of his second wife and stepdaughter. Although he had never been charged with his first family's murders, the evidence against him was damning. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Spangler would die in 2005, but the terror he left behind, 2 families torn apart and destroyed by his cold indifference, would live on. His case remains a grim reminder that sometimes the most dangerous killers are those who can hide behind a mask of normalcy and charm, only to strike when least expected. William Bradford Bishop, Jr. In the quiet suburbs of Montgomery County, Maryland, a horrific tragedy unfolded in 1976, one that would shatter the peaceful facade of family life and introduce one of the most chilling family murders in American history. William Bradford Bishop, Jr., an intelligent and seemingly successful man, would forever be remembered for the brutal killings of his wife, mother, and 3 sons. What made this case even more disturbing was the fact that Bishop didn't just murder his family, he vanished without a trace, leaving investigators and the world at large with more questions than answers. Bishop, a highly educated man with a strong background in academia, appeared to be the epitome of the American dream. He had a degree from Yale and worked for the United States Department of State, which gave him a stable career and a comfortable life. He had married his wife, Anne, in the 1960s, and together they had 3 children: Anne, 14, William III, 10, and Jeffrey, 5. They lived a typical suburban lifestyle. But behind closed doors, things were far from perfect. Bishop's marriage to Anne had been deteriorating for years, with the couple struggling through financial difficulties and marital strife. This was the first crack in the seemingly perfect facade of his life, a crack that would eventually lead to the unimaginable. The murders occurred on the night of March 1st, 1976. On that fateful evening, William Bradford Bishop took a hammer to his family. He bludgeoned his wife, Anne, and his mother, who was living with them at the time. But it didn't end there. His 3 sons, who had been helpless witnesses to the horrifying scene, were also beaten to death. The brutality of the killings was shocking, and investigators later described the scene as one of the most gruesome crime scenes they had ever encountered. Bishop had no remorse, and the premeditated nature of his actions became apparent when police later discovered that he had planned everything meticulously. After committing the murders, Bishop took the bodies of his family members and disposed of them in the woods in North Carolina, where they were found months later. But what truly made this case stand out was Bishop's audacity and calculated decision to flee. Instead of attempting to hide or cover up his actions, he chose to run, leaving his family's bodies behind as evidence. The investigation that followed was one of the most intense in Maryland's history. The police quickly discovered that Bishop had taken several steps to cover his tracks. He had packed his car with his passport, clothing, and personal items, and was seen driving towards the south. He also withdrew a large sum of money from his bank account in anticipation of his escape. A nationwide manhunt was launched, and the FBI added him to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. Despite this, Bishop remained elusive, evading capture for decades. Years passed with little to no leads on Bishop's whereabouts. His name faded from the headlines, but the investigation continued behind the scenes. In 1977, Bishop's father passed away, and a new twist emerged in the case. It was revealed that Bishop had been in contact with his family and even sent them letters under a false identity. This led investigators to believe that he was still alive and living somewhere overseas. As the years went by, Bishop's case became one of the most frustrating mysteries in the criminal world. Several reported sightings of him surfaced over the years, but none were ever verified. In 2014, a new composite sketch was released, showing what Bishop might look like as an older man. There was still hope that someone would recognize him, but no substantial leads came forward. The investigation is still ongoing, and Bishop remains one of the most infamous fugitives in U.S. history. His story serves as a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving. A man who once appeared to have it all, a successful career, a loving family, could, in the end, commit unspeakable horrors. The question remains, how could a man who appeared to be so normal, so respectable, commit such a heinous act? William Bradford. Bishop's story is a haunting testament to the darkness that can lie beneath the surface of an ordinary life. Though his whereabouts remain unknown, the memory of the crime he committed will forever be etched into the history of American true crime. Eddie Lee Sexton. In the 1990s, a man in Ohio orchestrated a series of horrific murders that would shake the very foundation of familial trust and reveal the disturbing power of manipulation. Eddie Lee Sexton, a man with an air of authority and control, preyed on the very people who should have trusted him the most, his children. His case is one of psychological manipulation and familial control, where a father used his power over his children to convince them to commit murder. What made Sexton's crimes even more chilling was the fact that he didn't just kill his victims himself, he made his own children do it, twisting their minds and emotions to serve his violent and selfish desires. Sexton's story begins in the small town of Circleville, Ohio. He had a difficult upbringing, one that was marked by abuse and neglect. These early experiences seemed to shape his worldview, and as an adult, Sexton struggled with the usual challenges: unemployment, financial issues, and a strained family life. However, his ability to manipulate others, especially his children, marked the beginning of his reign of terror. Sexton's first known crime was the murder of his son-in-law, Keith. Keith, who had married Sexton's daughter, was targeted by Sexton after the family had fallen out over financial disputes. Sexton, however, didn't simply kill Keith. Instead, he manipulated his own son, and later, his daughter, into carrying out the murder. Through an intense and sinister form of psychological control, Sexton convinced his children that Keith was an obstacle to the family's happiness, and they needed to rid themselves of him. In a tragic turn, they listened to their father. Keith was murdered in 1993, and Sexton's children became complicit in the crime, living under the belief that they had done what was necessary for the family's greater good. After the murder, Sexton continued his manipulation, using guilt, fear, and emotional blackmail to keep his children loyal to him. Sexton's ability to manipulate those around him was not limited to his children. He was a master at controlling his family's actions, playing on their insecurities and fears to ensure that they remained obedient to his will. But even the strongest manipulation cannot last forever. Eventually, Sexton's twisted influence over his children began to unravel, and the truth about Keith's murder began to surface. As police began investigating the crime, they slowly pieced together the dark secrets of Sexton's household. Eddie Lee Sexton was arrested in 1994, and after a lengthy investigation, it became clear that he had orchestrated not only Keith's murder, but had also played a role in the emotional breakdowns of his children. His manipulative tactics were examined by experts, revealing just how far he had gone to control the lives of those closest to him. Sexton was convicted for his role in the murder of Keith and sentenced to death. However, his sentence was later overturned due to legal technicalities, and instead, he was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Eddie Lee Sexton's case is one of the most disturbing examples of familial manipulation and psychological abuse. His story is a chilling reminder of the power that one person can have over others, especially when trust is manipulated and broken. Sexton's influence over his children was so profound that it led them to commit a murder they otherwise would never have considered. His crimes highlight the dangers of unchecked authority and control within families, and serve as a stark warning about the psychological effects of abuse. Ervil LeBaron, the 1970s and 1980s in the United States and Mexico were marked by the rise of extremist religious sects. But one story stands out for its brutal complexity and chilling impact. Ervil LeBaron, the leader of a polygamous Mormon fundamentalist group known as the Church of the Lamb of God, would orchestrate a string of murders that shocked the communities of both the United States and Mexico. His name would become synonymous with religious extremism, violence, and betrayal, as his path of destruction was paved not just by the killings of rivals, but also by the murders of his own family members, all in the name of maintaining power and control. LeBaron's rise to notoriety began in the 1950s when he broke away from the mainstream Mormon Church and established his own splinter group, the Church of the Lamb of God. His sect was rooted in radical interpretations of Mormon doctrine, particularly the belief in polygamy, and a strict adherence to patriarchal authority. LeBaron, who claimed to be divinely chosen, manipulated his followers, many of whom were vulnerable and disenfranchised, convincing them that his vision was ordained by God. As the leader of this religious cult, he amassed a significant number of followers, establishing a community in the Mexican desert where he and his followers would live in isolation from the outside world. LeBaron's control over his followers was absolute. He practiced polygamy and took numerous wives, but it wasn't just religious devotion that kept his followers loyal, it was fear. LeBaron ruled with an iron fist, demanding obedience from his followers and using violence as a tool of enforcement. As his influence grew, so did his paranoia. He became increasingly fearful of rivals within his own community, particularly his brothers, who were also leaders within the group. His delusions of divine power led him to believe that anyone who opposed him or threatened his authority needed to be eliminated. In the late 1970s, LeBaron began ordering the execution of family members and rivals who he saw as a threat to his power. His most infamous order came in 1972 when he instructed his followers to murder his brother, Joel LeBaron, who had publicly opposed his leadership and his increasingly violent methods. This marked the beginning of a series of killings that would stretch across several years. LeBaron's reign of terror would involve not only the killings of rival members, but also the deaths of his own relatives. The paranoia and violence that dominated his leadership would lead to a wave of killings within the polygamous community, all justified in his twisted view as necessary for maintaining God's will. LeBaron's control of his followers was absolute, and the murders he orchestrated were not limited to members of his own family. He also directed the killing of those who had left his church or who he perceived as threats to his power. These murders were often carried out in secret, with LeBaron's followers acting as both executioners and enforcers of his divine will. Many of the victims were left to die in remote areas, their bodies abandoned in the desert. For years, the killings went unnoticed by the wider public, hidden in the shadows of the isolated communities where LeBaron and his followers lived. However, in 1979, a series of arrests and investigations began to uncover the truth behind the bloodshed. In 1980, Ervil LeBaron was arrested and charged with orchestrating the murder of his brother Joel, as well as several other killings. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But despite his conviction, the legacy of his violence and manipulation would live on as his followers continued to spread his message and carry out his directives. Ervil LeBaron died in prison in 1981, but his influence would leave a lasting mark on the communities he terrorized. His violent actions, which were carried out under the guise of religious obedience, left behind a trail of destruction that affected both his family and his followers. The story of Ervil LeBaron is one of fanaticism, violence, and the destructive power of unchecked authority. His life serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of religious extremism and the lengths to which one man can go to control and manipulate others in the name of faith. Las Poquianchis. The Poquianchis were a family of 4 sisters from Mexico, whose name would become synonymous with one of the most brutal and widespread sex trafficking rings in history. Operating from the 1950s to 1964, the Poquianchi sisters ran a vast and ruthless prostitution empire that spanned multiple states in Mexico and reached as far as the United States. What makes their story even more horrifying is the fact that they were responsible for the deaths of at least 91 people. Though some estimates suggest that the number could be well over 200, making them one of the most notorious families in criminal history. The story of the Poquianchis begins with the four sisters, Eva, Maria, Delfina, and Carmen. They were raised in a small town in Jalisco, Mexico, and as they grew older, they became involved in a criminal enterprise that revolved around the exploitation of young women. The Poquianchis began by luring women into prostitution, often from impoverished backgrounds or orphanages, with promises of work and a better life. However, once the women entered the Poquianchi operation, they were trapped. The sisters forced these women into sex work, keeping them under strict control through threats, violence, and manipulation. At the height of their operation, the Poquianchi sisters controlled a network of brothels, primarily located in the state of Jalisco. They trafficked women throughout Mexico and even into the United States, forcing them to work in the sex trade under inhumane conditions. The women were physically and emotionally abused, and their lives were controlled by the sisters through a system of violence, fear, and isolation. Those who tried to escape were punished, and many were killed for attempting to flee the brothel system that the Poquianchis had created. The Poquianchis' reach extended beyond the brothels they ran. They also had connections to corrupt officials, who were bribed to look the other way as the sisters' empire flourished. Their wealth and power grew as the number of women they exploited increased, and for years, they operated with relative impunity. The sisters had a reputation for cruelty, and they would often kill women who attempted to escape, as well as those who they saw as a threat to their business. These murders were covered up, and the bodies of the victims were often disposed of in remote locations, making it difficult for authorities to track the scale of their crimes. In 1964, after years of unchecked violence and exploitation, the Poquianchis' empire came crashing down. Authorities in Mexico began to investigate the Poquianchi operation after reports from former victims started to surface. The investigation eventually led to the arrest of the four sisters. When the police raided their brothels, they discovered a staggering amount of evidence, both of the trafficking operation and the murders that the sisters had committed. The bodies of women who had been killed by the Poquianchis were found mass graves, and the full extent of their cruelty became apparent. The Poquianchis were arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including trafficking, exploitation, and murder. However, despite the overwhelming evidence against them, the sisters were able to avoid the full extent of justice due to their connections and power. They were eventually sentenced to prison terms, but the exact number of people they killed remains unknown. Estimates suggest that the number of victims could be as high as 200, making them one of the most deadly criminal families in history. The Poquianchis' story is one of extreme exploitation, manipulation, and violence. Their ability to control and victimize women, combined with their network of corruption, allowed them to operate for years without facing significant consequences. Their case remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the depths of human cruelty. While the Poquianchis were eventually arrested, the full extent of their operation and the number of lives they destroyed will never truly be known. Tommy Lynn Sells, in The Annals of American Criminal History, There are certain names that leave a lasting mark, not only because of the sheer number of victims they claimed, but also because of the terror they instilled in communities across the country. Tommy Lynn Sells is one of those names. Operating under the radar for nearly 2 decades, Sells was a serial killer whose violent spree began in the 1980s and lasted through the late 1990s. Known for his disturbing ability to blend into society, his life was one marked by unpredictability and a series of cold, calculated murders. Born in 1964 in the rural South, Tommy Lynn Sells seemed like an ordinary man at first glance. He grew up in a chaotic household, marked by frequent moves and familial instability, which many believe contributed to his deep-seated rage and inability to form meaningful connections. As a young adult, Sells began a pattern of violent behavior that would define his later years, moving from town to town, sometimes even city to city, never staying in one place long enough for authorities to catch on to his deadly activities. In his early years, Sells committed several minor crimes, from theft to assault. But it was the murder of a woman named Kathy that would eventually mark the beginning of his killing spree. In 1985, Sells brutally killed Kathy in her home. But his first known murder was just the tip of the iceberg. For the next 14 years, he would go on to claim at least 22 victims, spanning several states, but his real reign of terror began in 1999 when he murdered a mother and her 15-year-old daughter in Texas. The brutality of these killings shocked the community, especially when investigators realized that Sells had once again slipped away, leaving behind no trace of evidence to link him to the crime. Sells' modus operandi was chillingly random. He targeted people from all walks of life, often choosing vulnerable victims who were alone or unsuspecting. His crimes were often committed in homes, where he would enter without force and then strike without warning. Sometimes, he killed his victims by strangulation, other times by stabbing, and on occasion, by simply slitting their throats. The dissonance between his unassuming appearance and the horrific violence he perpetrated was what made him so terrifying. Authorities were never able to pinpoint a clear pattern, which only fueled the mystery surrounding his crimes. What made Sells particularly dangerous was his ability to vanish into the night after committing his murders. He didn't live in one place long enough to establish a pattern, and he was always on the move. He traveled extensively across Texas, Missouri, and the Midwest, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake, but rarely returning to the same area. He used the anonymity of the highways and the transient nature of his life to evade capture. Sells' downfall began in 1999 when he was finally caught for the brutal murders of a mother and daughter in Texas. His arrest? Sells shocked investigators by confessing to at least 22 murders, though many suspect the true number is much higher. He was finally apprehended after a combination of witness statements and DNA evidence tied him to the Texas murders. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Sells admitted to the murders, revealing that he was driven by a thirst for violence and that his killings were often random and spontaneous. During his trial, Sells was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. His chilling confessions and the evidence against him were irrefutable. And in 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection in Texas. Despite the violent nature of his crimes and the terror he instilled in countless communities, Sells remained strangely calm and detached throughout the trial and execution process. His story is one of a man driven by a deep and disturbing need to kill, someone who was able to evade the law for years while leaving behind a string of violent deaths. His legacy is that of an elusive, terrifying killer who left a lasting impact on those who survived the violence he left behind. The Clutter family murders. The brutal murders of the Clutter family in Holcomb, Kansas, in 1959 remain one of the most infamous and chilling cases in American criminal history. The story of this senseless crime not only shocked the nation, but also became the basis for Truman Capote's groundbreaking book, In Cold Blood, a work that would forever change the landscape of true crime literature. This case stands out not just because of the savage nature of the killings, but because of the cultural and psychological insights it provided into the minds of two killers, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, whose lives and motives were laid bare in Capote's detailed investigation. Herb Clutter, a prosperous farmer, lived on his family farm in Holcomb with his wife, Bonnie, and their 4 children, Kenyon, the 15-year-old son, and daughters, Nancy and Susan. The Clutters were well-respected members of their small town. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were a loving, hard-working family who lived a quiet life, far removed from the world of crime. Their murders, which seemed to come out of nowhere, defied any sense of logic or understanding. For many, it was as if the Clutter family had become victims simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. On November 15, 1959, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith, 2 ex-convicts, arrived at the Clutter home with a plan to rob them. Hickok had heard through a fellow inmate that Herb Clutter kept large amounts of cash at his home, and the 2 men believed that this would be an easy target. What began as a robbery quickly escalated into something much more violent. When they arrived at the Clutter farm, Hickok and Smith found that there was no cash, no fortune to be had. They decided instead to murder the family. Smith, with his volatile personality and deeply troubled history, was the more violent of the 2, and he took the lead in the killings. The couple was tied up and shot in their own home, along with their 2 younger children. Nancy and Kenyon were also murdered, each shot in cold blood. The chilling brutality of the killings shocked the residents of Holcomb. Hickok and Smith, after committing the murders, stole a small amount of money from the house and fled. The Clutter family's bodies were discovered the next day, and the investigation began in earnest. What followed was a manhunt that spanned weeks as law enforcement searched for the killers. Richard Hickok and Perry Smith were eventually caught in Las Vegas in December 1959, and the investigation quickly unraveled the details of the crime. During their interrogation, both men confessed to the murders in graphic detail, explaining how the senseless act had been carried out. The killers were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The trial, which followed in 1960, was a media sensation, partly due to the notoriety of the crime and the media coverage of Capote's investigation into the case. In 1965, after years of appeals, Hickok and Smith were executed by hanging in Kansas. Despite the brutal nature of their crime, Capote's investigation into their backgrounds, personalities, and psychological states transformed them from mere criminals into complex characters whose motivations were explored in depth in Cold Blood. Capote's book, which was published in 1966, became a bestseller and is still considered one of the most influential works of true crime ever written. It not only detailed the details of the Clutter family murders, but also explored the psychology of the killers, painting a chilling picture of the randomness of violence. The Clutter family murders remain one of the most infamous crimes in U.S. history, partly because of their senselessness and the way they shook a small, tight-knit community. But their place in history is also forever tied to the legacy of Truman Capote's masterpiece, which not only chronicled the horror of that night, but also delved deeply into the minds of the killers, showing how they could so casually and brutally take the lives of an innocent family.